Lewis, I've been thinking about alternate history lately. What if Hitler had actually won World War II? Like, what would that world even look like?
That's a dark question, Max, but it's worth exploring. Picture this: Hitler standing on a podium, crowd screaming Heil Hitler. Germans, French, Poles, Norwegians, all sorts of nationalities under his spell. The Soviet Union? Gone. Great Britain? Crushed. Millions executed, millions more enslaved in labor camps. And there's just one target left.
The United States.
Exactly. Hitler called Americans a race of mongrels. In this nightmare scenario, he's won Europe, and now he's sizing up America. It's hell on earth for most people. But here's the thing. To understand how he could have won, we need to look at what actually happened, and then twist reality just slightly.
So where does it start going differently?
Well, the real war began in 1939 when the Wehrmacht devastated Poland. The Blitzkrieg, meaning lightning war, was terrifyingly effective. Panzer tanks, mobile infantry, coordinated airstrikes. The Poles never stood a chance.
I remember reading about that. The bombing was ruthless, wasn't it?
Absolutely ruthless. In September, German bombs hit the town of Luck. Buildings destroyed, kids killed on their way to school. A pilot named B.J. Solak described the stench of burning, a brown veil of smoke filling the air. No one was spared. The Luftwaffe rained hellfire on Poland. Derailed trains, screaming children seeing corpses everywhere. It was terror no one expected.
That's when Britain and France declared war, right?
September 3rd, 1940. But here's the shocking part. France fell in just 6 weeks. 6 weeks, Max. And most of the French accepted the Vichy government, which was sympathetic to Nazi ideology. A lot of people don't realize how much anti-Semitism existed in France at the time. Many endorsed Hitler's hatred toward Jews. Keep that in mind.
6 weeks for France? That seems impossible.
Denmark, Norway, Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, all beaten. The German soldiers seemed superhuman, which wasn't far from the truth. They were heavily using Pervitin, a powerful methamphetamine. And with Norway defeated, Hitler gained access to heavy water, a key ingredient for nuclear bombs, though nobody fully understood that at the time.
So the pieces were already falling into place for something worse.
Much worse. When France fell and the British escaped from Dunkirk, it looked like Germany was invincible. The conquests cost tens of thousands of German lives, but France lost 50,000 men, Britain 11,000, and now Germany had 1.5 million prisoners of war. It would have been catastrophic if not for that miracle at Dunkirk.
Britain was next then. Everyone must have been terrified.
They were waiting for the Battle of Britain. Most people didn't think this small island could hold its own, but the fighting spirit was still there. Paul Ritchie, a wounded British soldier flown back from France, said he couldn't imagine Britain going the way France had. But he was worried. His mind was still filled with the blast and flame that shattered France, and he was disgusted by what he called the smug contentedness behind Britain's sea barrier.
What did Churchill say about all this?
On June 18, 1940, Churchill spoke at the House of Commons. In his incredible oratory style, he said, "I expect the Battle of Britain is about to begin. Upon this battle depends the survival of Christian civilization. Upon it depends our own British life." He was probably right, Max. He went on to say Hitler knew he had to break Britain or lose the war. If Britain failed, the whole world, including the United States, would sink into what he called the abyss of a new dark age.
He really understood what was at stake.
He did. And notice, he specifically said Hitler would go after the USA eventually. It was just a matter of time. Churchill was drunk and drugged up half the time, but he correctly envisioned the hell Hitler would unleash. That's why he refused to settle with Hitler. He knew at some point the furious Führer would have Britain in shackles and take over its empire. Hitler would not stop until Nazi ideology pervaded the globe.
So the Battle of Britain was the real turning point.
In our reality, yes. British Hawker Hurricanes and Spitfires fought German Messerschmitt Bf-109s in the skies. The dogfights were insane. Many young pilots went up and didn't come back alive. One Spitfire pilot described it like this: "We were both flying in a tight circle. Just a little more and I'll have him. Pressing the trigger, I waited expectantly for the 109 to explode. I've hit his wing.
What were the survival rates like?
Grim. Life expectancy for an RAF pilot was terrible. 60% of operational airmen died, were injured, or became prisoners of war. Around 51% of all RAF aircrew died. German Junkers bombed strategic locations in England for 8 months during what the Brits called the Blitz, sirens blaring constantly.
How did regular people cope with that?
The British were typically amenable to hardships. One woman wrote in her diary, "I wonder what the pilots feel. After all, somebody loves them, even if they're Nazis." Can you imagine that level of humanity during bombing raids?
That's remarkable. But Hitler made mistakes, didn't he?
Big ones. At some point, Hitler withdrew aircraft for Russia's planned invasion in May 1941. That was a huge mistake. The Germans lacked a coherent strategic plan. Their planes often missed targets, and British scientists were excellent at reading German signals and jamming their radars. Plus, the British public showed real fortitude. A woman named Barbara Dixon wrote that she'd never even heard of Poland, but she'd do anything to repel that beast Hitler, who was trying to blow us up or murder us in our beds.
So historians think attacking Britain was a blunder?
One of Germany's great blunders, along with invading the Soviet Union. If Hitler had focused all his strength on Britain instead of saying, "We'll come back for you later," the Brits might have settled. Many people in Britain wanted that. They didn't think Hitler was as crazy as he turned out to be.
Really? People wanted to settle with Hitler?
Hitler had expressed his liking for British culture many times. Unlike those mongrels in America, he said Britain had good Aryan culture. Before German propaganda criticized the British for their empire's atrocities and their plutocrats living like kings while the working class lived in slums, Hitler had pretty good relations with certain British politicians.
But they held out.
They did. Britain's army was nothing compared to Germany's, and no one expected them to hold their own in the skies. Even the U.S. ambassador in London, Joseph Kennedy, said Britain had no chance. But despite 23,000 civilians dying and around 33,000 injured, Britain held. It's thought 1,000 RAF planes were shot down, with about 544 fighter command pilots killed. With bombers and coastal guard losses, that added up to 1,542 planes lost, and another 1,542 lives lost. The German Luftwaffe lost around 1,800 planes and more than 2,500 pilots killed.
That victory changed everything, didn't it?
Absolutely. An American journalist wrote, Adolf Hitler met his first defeat in 8 years in what might go down in history as a battle as important as Waterloo or Gettysburg. Winston Churchill said those famous words, "Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few." This bolstered confidence in the U.S. and elsewhere. Germany wasn't invincible. It sent a powerful message. And with Britain having the most powerful navy in the world at the time, no Germans would be walking down British streets anytime soon.
But Hitler planned to come back for Britain?
He did, just as soon as he dealt with the Soviet Union. And this is why we've spent time on this. If Britain had been soundly beaten and backed down, the whole outcome of the war would have been different. With Britain out, Germany could have focused less on one very formidable foe in Europe, Asia, and Africa.
It would have sent a message to the Soviet Union and the United States, too.
Exactly. Remember, the U.S. didn't want to get involved in a bloody European war. U.S. citizens didn't want their young men shot to pieces far from America's industrious shores. But in our alternative universe, let's say Germany succeeded in having air superiority over Britain.
Operation Sea Lion. The land invasion?
Right. That wasn't Hitler's first choice, though. He'd been hoping Britain would accept his offer to back down. Here's what Hitler said needed to happen for that invasion to succeed. First, the RAF had to be beaten down in its morale, and in fact, that it can no longer display any appreciable aggressive force in opposition to the German crossing.
What else did he need?
The English Channel swept of mines, and the British Navy distracted with fighting in the North Sea and Mediterranean. That would make crossing into England more achievable. Apparently, even Hitler's inner circle wasn't keen on this idea. Most contemporary historians will tell you he would have failed.
Why? What made it so difficult?
Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt suspected Hitler was just bluffing Britain into pulling out. He said, "By God, even Napoleon failed to invade Britain. The place was a fortress." The German Navy, the Kriegsmarine, was no match for the British Navy. It ruled the waves and had for years.
But in your alternate scenario,
In our scenario, Britain lost in the air. Military and public morale was very low. The British Navy was spread out, just as Hitler wanted. The German Navy fought remarkably well, better than expected, and before you could say Schadenfreude, the powerful British elites were watching panzer tanks make a mess of that beautiful British grass. The country surrendered, just as France had.
and that's when Hitler could really win the war.
Now Britain was finished. With France and Britain subdued, and, to our modern shame, many people in both countries were buying into Hitler's Aryan nonsense, the Germans could go full throttle at the Soviet Union.
Let's talk about that invasion. What actually happened in real life?
Hitler had made a non-aggression pact with Stalin, but then he invaded Russia anyway. Never trust the word of a tyrant. The German army, full of confidence, was sure it would walk through Russia. They thought they were doing the right thing, too. An 18-year-old German soldier named Henry Mettelmann said, "I accepted as natural that it was German duty for the good of humanity to impose our way of life on lower races and nations, who, probably because of their limited intelligence, would not quite understand what we were on about."
That's horrifying.
Hitler hated Jews, but he was no fan of Slavs either. His notion that most Germans were pure Aryans was utterly ridiculous given centuries of intermixing in Northern Europe. It was ridiculous full stop, but he was prepared to annihilate Slavic people. Once he'd won in Russia, communists would either forfeit their ideology or die. The millions of Jews in the Soviet Union would be hunted down and killed.
What did the German generals think about this?
General Erich Heppner said, "The war with Russia is a vital part of the German people's existence. It is the old fight of German against the Slav, the defense of European culture against the Muscovite Asiatic flood, and the repulse of Jewish Bolshevism." So mark my words, the people of the Soviet Union would have been spared no quarter, at least those that fit into what Hitler described as lower races.
But Stalin was no saint either, was he?
By the time Stalin died, he had the blood of tens of millions on his paranoid hands. But his zero-tolerance approach to people not fighting was one reason Germany couldn't defeat him. The Soviets killed around 300,000 of their own soldiers for refusing to fight, fighting badly, or going AWOL. People starved because Stalin focused on building weaponry above feeding his people. Some even changed sides because they detested Stalin so much. But if he hadn't been so bloody despotic, Germany might well have won.
So his brutality actually helped defeat Hitler?
In a way, yes. For Operation Barbarossa, Hitler deployed around 3.6 million troops, 2,700 aircraft, and 3,600 tanks. Record-breaking for European warfare. Stalin had 2.9 million troops, 8,000 aircraft, and 11,000 tanks. But the Germans were superior in technology and general warfare.
But in your alternate scenario, if Germany had just defeated Britain,
There would be a spring in the military step. They'd also be making use of that excellent British arms industry. In real life, Hitler had thousands of French prisoners of war slaving away in munitions, plus around 650,000 French civilian laborers, not to mention the Vichy French fighting for Germany.
and the US at this point, what were they thinking?
In real life, many Americans didn't have much love for the Soviet Union. The famed aviator Charles Lindbergh said at the time, "I would 100 times rather see my country ally herself with Britain, or even Germany with all her faults, than the cruelty, the godlessness, and the barbarism of the Soviet Union."
Lindbergh said that? He was a hero.
There was more support for Nazism in the U.S. than you might think. Hence Philip Roth's alternate reality novel, The Plot Against America. The industrialist Henry Ford admired Nazi Germany. He was anti-Semitic for much of his life, publishing books with titles like The International Jew, The World's Foremost Problem.
So in the alternate reality, with Britain defeated and the US not helping,
There's every chance Germany could have won in Russia, especially if Japan also attacked Russia. Think about it. With Britain defeated, Japan wouldn't have had to fight in Singapore, Hong Kong, Malaya, and Burma.
and all those British Empire forces,
Exactly. The impact of countries from the British Empire that fought alongside Britain was enormous. British India alone, 2.5 million troops fought under British command. Canada, which was a dominion of the British Empire, couldn't have fought on. Australia provided manpower and resources.
I know this is simplified, but walk me through what happens next in your scenario.
Let's say after Britain fell, the invasion of Russia went as Hitler planned. It was over within a year. This really could have happened if things had been just slightly different. Now, what would the USA be thinking after much of Europe and some of Asia had fallen to Hitler and Japan?
They still wouldn't want to fight, would they?
Americans didn't want to fight in a European war. William Calhoun, the head of Harvard, said, "Hitler's going to win. Let's be friends with him." Many people thought this way, but they weren't fully aware of Hitler's plans for world domination and the sheer ugliness of what he was capable of.
But the US was involved somehow, right?
The US had meddled by freezing assets and preventing Japan from getting the oil it needed. Japan didn't like this American interference. The US wasn't totally out of the war, lending weapons to Britain, helping in other ways, all for a price. But then companies like GM, Ford, and IBM also sold what was described as useful war materials to Germany. The US made hay while bombs spilled down on Europe, coming out of the war much richer.
Pearl Harbor changed everything, though.
It might have stayed that way if Japan hadn't launched that attack. Japan hoped that after attacking the US Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor, the US would revert to isolationist policies. But in our alternate reality, the US had watched Germany's Operation Barbarossa succeed, and Britain and France become spent forces. In this case, had Pearl Harbor happened, the US might not have retaliated. Or, had history been different, the US might not have interfered at all, and Pearl Harbor wouldn't have happened in the first place.
So that's the state of the world in your alternate timeline.
Right now, Hitler is over the moon. But he has enemies everywhere in his vanquished countries. That's why he's sending out death squads to hunt down people he doesn't like. He deploys mobile death squads, the Einsatzgruppen. They scour German-occupied Europe looking for victims. Jewish people, communists, gypsies, anti-fascists, even intellectuals.
Intellectuals? Why them?
Hitler didn't leave all the work to death squads. He prepared a list in 1940 of what he perceived to be dangerous Brits, kept in his Black Book. He was well aware that many people in occupied Britain despised him. The French had a resistance, but it was small and only really significant near the end of the war. There would have been resistance in Britain, too.
What was in this Black Book?
It contained 2,820 names. Jews, journalists, anti-fascists, spies, politicians, academics, novelists, all to be immediately arrested once Britain was successfully invaded. This book gives you some idea about what would have happened if Hitler had won.
Were there famous names in there?
Some would surprise you. Aldous Huxley, the writer of Brave New World, was in there. If Hitler had won in England, Huxley might not have had the chance in 1949 to congratulate George Orwell on his dystopian novel 1984. I doubt he would have written to Orwell saying, "Within the next generation, I believe that the world's leaders will discover that infant conditioning is more efficient as instruments of government than clubs and prisons." He was right, as it turned out in the long run.
So Hitler would be doing a lot of that flogging and kicking.
In the UK and elsewhere. Perhaps Huxley and other British intellectuals who liked the idea of freedom would have been sent to Nazi extermination camps. These Brits had no idea they were on Hitler's hit list. The playwright Noel Coward wrote after the war, "If anyone had told me at that time that I was high up on the Nazi blacklist, I should have laughed and told them not to talk nonsense."
People really didn't understand what Hitler would do.
For the most part, no. No one really understood what Hitler would do to secure his vision of a Nazi-led utopia. In Britain and the Soviet Union, Jews, gypsies, communists, certain intellectuals were sent to labor camps to work or die. Young and fit people in Britain and Russia would be drafted to work for the Nazi war machine and its general industries.
And this machine had to keep expanding.
Because Hitler had the USA in his sights, a country now wondering if Churchill had been right and if they should have helped earlier when Germany was more vulnerable. Meanwhile, Britain adopts a new government in line with the Nazi regime, an authoritarian, anti-Semitic, xenophobic government led by Oswald Mosley, whose British Union of Fascists had just been resurrected after being disbanded in 1940.
Who was Mosley exactly?
Not too many years earlier, Hitler had kept a keen eye on Mosley. He was impressed when Mosley said things like, "For the first time, I openly and publicly challenged the Jewish interests of this country, commanding commerce, commanding the press, commanding the cinema, dominating the city of London, killing industry with their sweatshops."
And people followed him?
With Hitler at the helm and Mosley as his man in England, the German propaganda machine went into hyperdrive. What's astounding is how quickly many people in Britain embraced what Mosley was saying. He promised an end to corrupt banking, telling them the upper classes had kept them in bondage for centuries. Soon, thugs like the Old King and church mobs squashed any resistance to British fascists. People were afraid to speak out. Progressives were hunted down. Something similar was happening in Russia.
Wait, Russia had fascists too?
The Russian Fascist Party had never been that big. But now, with Stalin and almost all of the Politburo exterminated or in labor camps, and with Germans releasing thousands of Soviet prisoners from gulags, many people started to believe the Nazi propaganda. Millions had died under Stalin. Millions more had been on the verge of starvation or been sent to gulags, living in fear. That's why it didn't take long for these deeply oppressed people to embrace another form of government, one that promised a better society.
Out of desperation, they chose fascism.
As time went on, while Germany focused much of its efforts on industry and taking back African colonies lost after World War I, something strange was happening in the USA. The German propaganda machine under Joseph Goebbels was incredibly effective, even far away in the US.
How did they pull that off?
The mass exterminations had been kept from the world's eyes for the most part, despite rumors and spying. The US public didn't know about those wicked massacres of innocent people. So, as the Nazis spewed propaganda about how their new world order was rescuing people from out-of-control capitalist slavery and releasing them from chains the Jewish elite had supposedly placed on them, a worrying number of people were taking interest in the fascist movement in the US.
This was right after the Great Depression.
Exactly. Remember, this is a country where a massive part of the poorer population had just gone through absolute hell during the Great Depression. Hitler blamed all that on the Jews, and when leading fascism supporters in the US talked, some American people listened. The Canadian Union of Fascists spoke at events too. When Charles Lindbergh stood up and promoted his America First policy, pro-fascist, isolationist, crowds cheered. These crowds kept growing, and anti-Semitic sentiment grew with it.
How bad did it get?
Even though the USA was already backward when it came to civil rights compared to other advanced nations, racism became even more intense throughout the nation. The fascists said, "Leave Europe to its own devices." Any intervention would likely be disastrous, given the great power of Germany. People looked up to Lindbergh when he said things like, "A few far-sighted Jewish people realize this and stand opposed to intervention, but the majority..."
Because he was a hero.
This guy was a national hero. When he spoke, many people were glued to his every word. The U.S. government had awarded him the Medal of Honor and the Distinguished Flying Cross. But now the Nazis had also given him a medal, the Commander Cross of the Order of the German Eagle.
So the Nazis had influence in America through people like him.
The Nazis knew that Lindbergh and Ford, two of the most powerful men in America, often discussed what they and the Nazis called the Jewish problem. Perhaps, Hitler thought, Germany didn't need to attack the U.S. at its borders. Perhaps he could take control from within, with the help of an American fascist party working on his behalf.
That's insidious, using America's own divisions against it.
Hitler mused that it wasn't as if this country of mongrels didn't already have widespread white supremacy. America could quite easily be pushed over the edge, he assumed. Those he called mongrels would once again be enslaved and Jews would be executed. The racial segregation that already existed in the U.S. would just be taken up a notch.
Did Hitler still think the U.S. military was weak?
Hitler had once said the U.S. military posed no threat, but he changed his mind. Invading the U.S., he knew, was an almost impossible task. even though part of him believed the country's military was weak due to its racial diversity. He wrote in his diary one day that he'd like nothing more than to see New York in flames.
What about Japan and all this?
Japan had already been granted part of the former Soviet Union, and the country was certainly up for an invasion of the US. But would it work? The months passed, the year ticked over, and the power of the Nazis just grew and grew. Now with so much European industry under its control, and an army like the world had never seen, the US was a David to the Goliath of Germany.
That's why the isolationists won people over.
Exactly. War would mean mass death. It would mean certain defeat. Why not, just as so many had said, be on good terms with Hitler? Do some trade with him. To become his enemy seemed like a death sentence. And finance-wise, it made no sense at all.
But could Hitler actually invade the US?
Hitler contemplated the costs of a long-distance invasion. Even with British ships now under his control, taking that many men across the sea was a Herculean task. Feeding those men, getting fuel for machines, moving all that equipment across the ocean, it seemed like a bridge too far.
But there was Canada.
If the Canadian fascists, who were gaining popularity like the British fascists had, went for war, a land invasion against the, quote, decadent capitalists could happen overland from Canada. It would take time and the movement of many resources, not to mention it would be very risky. Things weren't looking good for the US. People were thinking, damn, if the UK had only been able to repel Germany, none of this would have happened. That little island losing to the Nazis had changed the entire outcome of world history.
What a nightmare scenario.
Then, one day Hitler is sitting at his desk, and he receives a report that took months to compile. The report states that throughout Europe, an estimated 9.7 million Jews have been exterminated. It also states that 350,000 homosexuals have been killed, along with close to 840,000 Romani and Sinti people. Things moved much faster since Europe was defeated.
Those numbers.
The report doesn't state how many disabled people died in the camps, although Hitler is pleased when he reads they're being used for medical experiments. People of color and intellectuals are mostly being employed in slave labor, though many have also been exterminated.
What about the atomic bomb? Where does that come into play?
Meanwhile, scientists working in the USA are making headway with an atomic bomb project. Little do they know that if they could have collaborated with scientists in Britain, the project would almost be complete. Now Hitler has control over Britain's project, seeing that under Mosley, Britain is nothing more than a German puppet state. It also helps that former King Edward VIII has been restored to the throne, a much more suitable monarch for the Nazis than George VI.
So, what's life actually like in this new Europe?
Hitler believes he can create a utopian society, but only when the people he thinks cause the world's problems are all dead: man, woman, and child. He hates religion, but in his new empire, he actually endorses religious tolerance. This is more out of fear of mass resistance than anything else.
Religious tolerance? From Hitler?
He also promotes selective polygamy, believing that if you mix the right genes, you'll create the right product. Products for his army, for his science projects, for his idea of societal harmony. At times, this is oppressive for women, who are usually the ones selected. Strangely, for a man with so much blood on his hands, Hitler detests cruelty to animals, and even endorses, but doesn't enforce, national vegetarianism.
That's bizarre. Such contradictions.
At the same time, he abhors what he calls degenerative art, and hates the artists just as much, even if they tick the right box for his so-called master race. He bans pornography in Germany, as well as prostitution, some intellectual pursuits, certain kinds of writing and poetry, decadent music, excessive boozing, and smoking.
What about his puppet states?
His puppet states aren't asked to conform to these ideals, but in many cases, the new fascists around Europe espouse and enforce Nazi ideals. In some ways, those who follow Hitler do see some benefits. Some businesses and industries improve since Hitler has taken a zero-tolerance stand against corruption. The totalitarian way, he says, must be simple and without deceits. It's also horribly oppressive and leads to unhappiness that people try not to show.
A false utopia.
Just as one critic in the US says, the utopia that Hitler seeks can never be free from tyranny. Anyone who says they don't like this new paradise will be severely punished. The guy who writes that is soon beaten up by one of the now widespread pro-fascist mobs in the US.
What year are we at now in the scenario?
The year is now 1944. For some time, British scientists have been working on an atomic bomb under the Tube Alloys Project, something kept secret from everyone except those who need to know in Canada. This project was actually started before the USA's Manhattan Project.
Before the Manhattan Project?
The Brits had forecast a bomb not being ready until 1947, but once the new German and Soviet scientists join the project and the Germans have more facilities, newly built heavy bombers, and a hell of a lot more money to make the bombs, the project is completed in 1944. But the US Manhattan Project is also just about ready.
So both sides have atomic weapons.
Little do the world's public know that a nightmare situation is taking place. In 1945, both sides test their bombs, and now it's known just how much destructiveness is in the hands of leaders. More concerning, in the hands of a man who thinks very little of American mongrels.
Does Hitler actually want to use these weapons?
Here's the strange thing. Hitler, despite the fact he's gassed millions of people, does not embrace the use of superweapons. He's even held off on using chemical weapons, even though the Germans at the start of the war had a huge stockpile of deadly sarin gas. So it's not surprising that he doesn't like the thought of using an atomic bomb.
And the US wouldn't use it either because...
The US was well aware of what would come back if it dropped a bomb. And why would it, when Hitler hasn't yet made it clear he will invade the US? As crazy as Hitler is, he,